Well, it's not something under the purview of this.
I understand, but
I
is there
just tell you.
something that can come from this group that can be used?
Not a thing. I'm just telling you, I mean, I don't have a statutory basis or a foundation, and it's not my business to tell CDPHE how to do their business, and they would never try and tell me how to do my business. I understand, I hear what you're saying, but that's an issue that's probably more suitable for the CDPHE Advisory Council. That's really that issue. Don't mean to be blunt, but that's really the way it is. So.
But it makes everybody doing their job in this room considerably more difficult in the operations of the business to have such a lackadaisical approach from the Department of Health to getting these cards out.
Well, I don't know that I agree with that, and regardless of what that mandate is or how they do things, I will still move forward with the regulation I do. It's a necessary element. It's the check and balance for, the patient registry card is just one half of it. And as we've discussed, there's probably going to be legislation that deals with that issue, and, it may close some loopholes and develop others. That's kind of how our process works. Enough said. Any other comments on the identification?
I've got some thoughts on what Ed just talked about. I mean, obviously, we can't force the health department to do anything, but what we can do is structure our own processes to essentially render them as irrelevant as possible. Some of us over here in this corner have been trying to get the health department to do its job now for 8 years. We've been unsuccessful. It's not going to happen. So I think if we, on our end, decide that you get your doctor's recommendation and you send your paperwork in, and that's good enough. And if the health department is dragging its feet, then it's not the patient's fault. And the patient doesn't suffer for some other governmental agency not doing its job. So that would be.
And again, Rob, I hear what you're saying, but it's not true. I'm just going to move on. Thank you.
But we're regulating the centers, which is not necessarily dependent on what the health department does or doesn't do.
And I intend to move forward regulating what the centers. That's what it's all about. We're talking about the ID reg now. It's on page 67 if you've got your book open. So if you've got comments about the ID reg, I'm happy to listen to them. If not, we're going to move on. The discussion we had was whether or not the 3 forms of ID listed there were adequate or whether or not we should add a passport. Was there another form of ID that anybody had comments on? And I asked CDPHE to send me the list of what they use for the registry, and I'll take that into account for our next meeting as well. Just if nothing else, to find parity between the two.
We already talked about passports, Department of Corrections, IDs, and tribal identification cards.
No, we talked about passports as a potential addition.
I'd like people in the Department of Corrections to be able to access their medicine, so I think that identification ought to suffice. And then tribal ID cards that are Indian tribes that issue them.
I don't know anything about a tribal ID card.
I don't know much about it, but I know I've seen them, and I know they're government documents issued by the tribal governments.
Do you know what they ask and how they validate?
I don't. I can check into that, though.
I can look into that as well. I've investigated, and it varies from tribe to tribe considerably. So it's not necessarily, doesn't have the same force or specificity or clarity of identification as these other documents would. But I can send you that.
Okay.
And there's no unanimity.
Okay. Barb, did you have a comment?
Sorry, random question. I have a 9-year-old patient who has a state-issued ID from 1960 before there were expirations on them. Would this be considered, would this, is there a concern there? Because that was a question she actually had, because she couldn't get it down. It was difficult for her to get down and get a new ID and there's no expiration on it. Is that kosher?
So that if I heard you right, you said you had a patient that has an ID from 1960?
In the 60s, without from somewhere in the 60s, without an expiration on it.
They have a patient registry card?
They have their application, they're at 90 just becoming a patient.
Okay.
So I just
Once
wanted
we
to
get
make sure that
beyond
was
another
valid.
test, if we promulgate this rule and it says it's an acceptable ID, it's an acceptable ID. Yeah. And Jessica?
So this leads me to the question of some places when you've got your temporary driver's license, let's say you lose a driver's license, your wallet gets stolen, something like that, places, that initial temporary does not have a photo on that. Places are supposed to honor that as an ID in spite of the fact that it does not have a photo. Now, if your driver's license was your sole and only photo ID and you lost it, in that several weeks it can take to get the new license, some patients' needs are so great that they would need to get their medicine renewed in that time. So would a birth certificate be something that they could use for something like that?
No.
So that person would just be, no, I mean, I have about 7 different photo IDs that are not legal, Sam's Club, you know, things that they have my picture on them.
There's a couple of issues with the ID, and I'm just going to say it. You get a Sam's card, for sake of argument, they don't ask for your age, they don't validate anything. And
No.
so the purpose of these IDs is just for that. I mean, to get one of these 3 IDs, there's a process that's in place. We know the standards behind them when they're issued and the integrity, quite frankly, of their issuance. And so if we can find comparable kinds of things out there that have those kinds of components, I'm willing to consider.
All I know is that the temporary driver's license that you're issued at the DMV for a few weeks until they mail you your hard copy is legally supposed to be honored, but I feel like a lot of centers would feel uncomfortable honoring that since there's no photo on that. So we would need to find
I agree.
some way for that to legally be able to be honored with some other proof of photo, just to, you know, prove that that's who you are.
Brian, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just wondering how this would address a sale from a licensee to a caregiver. Is that because the caregiver is not necessarily a patient? Is that something being addressed here, addressed in another area, or what's?
No, I'm trying to remember what 1284 says relative to caregivers. You can sell to caregivers for patients' purposes, for transporting on behalf of patients. Is that the situation you're referring to?
I think specifically, I think it refers to like homebound patients that
Right.
have caregivers purchase on their behalf. So I'm just wondering if this is too narrowly constructed, where it says, because a caregiver is not always a patient, right? And if we have a licensee being restricted to only selling to people that can provide a valid card, how does that deal with caregivers purchasing from homebound patients?
I believe we've addressed that in the delivery reg. Go back and look at your drafts and see if it relates to caregivers. I'm sure it does, because of that process with CDPHE's involvement, the waiver and all of those kind of things. Check and see if it's in there. If not, we can add the word caregiver, or just for that situation, or the delivery by caregivers to homebound patients or something along those lines, to clarify if it's not in there.
I would assume that a center would still want to see the caregiver's photo ID to prove that they were, in fact, the caregiver listed on that paperwork. Because they would still have paperwork for the patient in question that they were showing to have access to the center. So they would just need to show their photo ID.
Yeah, their photo ID, but in correlation with their caregiver registration.
Right, they'd have to show the paperwork showing that I'm a caregiver for this patient, and then they can't show that person's ID, so they would have to show their own and show that their name matches the caregiver spot on that paperwork. It doesn't seem that complicated.
No, I don't think it is either. That's a good catch.
And Matt, we obviously, CDAC would object to any type of Department of Corrections, since 1284 specifically prohibits the use of medical marijuana while in a correctional facility, a community corrections facility, or subject to a sentence of incarceration.
Okay. Thank you. Other comments?
That's the word on the street.
I would look at it there pretty easy, but that
You
should
get any other,
Yeah, it should.
much more hardcore
They should have vaporizer rooms in the hospitals.
They can do edibles in there. Much better for the patients.